Over the rainbow, way up high. I'm going to descant now. You find love.
That's not a descant, that's just singing an octave higher.
I basically 1 in 10 times I actually say to Cara, I'm going to descant, and I actually manage to descant. But 9 in 10 is just me singing higher.
I used to write the old descant for hymns.
Somehow that didn't surprise me. You're just one of these people who musically very gifted and could probably just turn your hand to it. You know, that's very...
Well, I just had a go at doing it.
But I'm a singer. I'm going to record my
define I'm a singer.
Okay, 3, 2, 1. Well, hi everyone, and welcome back to the Engage podcast. And how are you, Peter?
I'm doing well, James, thank you. How are you doing?
Good, yeah. Do you notice something different about me? No tie.
There we go.
I know,
You're moving back to the dark side.
I know, I am. But I decided that I was wearing a tie when I came in, and I actually think I picked just a bad combo today.
Right, okay.
It's a bit distressing. I pride myself normally on really getting it right, but I got it wrong. I don't think actually this shirt and this suit particularly work, if I'm honest with you. And I would be interested in viewer feedback. If you think that I've got it wrong from a sartorial point of view, is that the right word? Sartorial, like... look it up quick.
Yeah,
We're just going to have to check. We're just going to check. We're just looking it up.
I've not heard that as an adjective before.
Yeah, sartorial.
It's a sartorial, isn't it?
That's what I meant, sartorial.
That's what...
Good, yes.
It sounded like a mixture of satire and style all in one.
What did you say again? Sartorial.
Sartorial,
yes. If you think I've got it sartorially wrong, let us know. But that's enough of this nonsense. I think we need to get straight into the topics.
Absolutely. We've got a packed program today, haven't we?
Yeah, and I hope people are enjoying this slightly adjusted format where we cover more than one topic. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that in future we're not happy to talk about one big thing. But what we found is actually often we come to a week of recording and we're like, well, there are quite a few things we'd like to talk about. So hopefully that's helpful. And we've been so encouraged by recent viewing figures. More than that, I've been encouraged personally. I've been out and about quite a lot recently as part of our church engagement work, and people have been coming up to me, from Bournemouth and then the southwest in Yate. They've been coming up to me and they've been saying, we love the podcast.
Yeah.
They love the dynamic, they love the chemistry. They're like, wow, James, like brilliant, so good, and really nice that you give opportunities to that other guy.
That is brutal.
I was a bit brutal. And it's not true at all. I am the Padawan. You are the master.
No, that is also not true.
Just here to learn.
It is really lovely getting feedback, though, isn't it? And I had a chat with someone who came up a few weeks ago who I hadn't met before, who said how he listens to a podcast religiously, which I thought was a lovely thing to hear. It was also ironic, given we are a faith-based podcast. But no, please do let us know when you're enjoying stuff.
I had one message from a pastor friend of mine who said, I don't really know how I feel about this, but I just suddenly was minding my own business. It was an afternoon off. I was having a good time, and then your dulcet tones I suddenly heard coming from my daughter's phone because she was listening to the latest podcast.
There we go.
How about that?
Connecting with the
rising generation.
Indeed.
I don't know what the word generate. Gen A. I think it's Alpha. So that is Gen A. Alpha A.
Yes, but
yes,
what is?
Call them Alpha. Sorry.
What is Greek?
Yes. Well, I know a bit of New Testament Greek. Kurios.
Very good.
Thank you.
Well done.
Armartie.
I beg your pardon.
I think it's supposed to be sin.
It would be probably Amartia.
Yes. Pronunciation was never my strong point.
I got quite confused. It sounded like you were talking about an Italian fashion brand rather than.
No, honestly, when I did a bit of, and our producer is getting exasperated with us, but I'll just finish with this bit and then we will move on. When I did a bit of New Testament Greek when I was training, because the guy I trained with was proficient in both Hebrew and Greek and loves the languages, and I found that when it came to like the memory test, so learning vocab, I was very good at, pretty good at. But I did this test in my first year of training before Christmas, and I passed it. I got like 51%, and the feedback was every question in the test that had deliberately been put there to test whether I understood anything about how the language actually worked, I failed.
Oh dear.
And so then the inevitable sort of I don't know if it's worth our while continuing.
Oh, it's for words you never want to hear.
Well, actually, I did want to hear them. I was thrilled.
Okay, right, fair enough.
But let's move on. We're going to talk, first of all, about welfare.
Yeah.
Then there's a case that's just come out of a retired preacher in Northern Ireland, and it's a free speech case. We'll come on to that.
Yeah.
And then finally, if there's time, we want to just talk a little bit about the topic you wrote about in the recent Friday long read to do with choking consent, but also a very, very important review that Baroness Burton has done that CARE is particularly pleased with. So we'll get to that. But first of all, let's talk about welfare. So here's a question to start us off with. We're talking about this because welfare is very much in the news. So the headlines today, all about the fact that there's a growing Labour rebellion over the Prime Minister and Chancellor's plan to make some adjustments and, dare I say, cuts to certain types of welfare allowances. Now, before we get to the details, when you hear the word welfare, what comes to mind?
This is a kind of question which really exposes whether you're left wing or right wing, doesn't it?
That's why I've asked it. No,
I guess there are two competing things in my head. There's the idea of looking after those who are who really need help. But there is also it sort of brings to mind kind of the ideas of some people who are being supported who perhaps shouldn't be. And I guess that is the tension which the government are currently trying to work through. Go on, I'm going to put that one back in the other foot because that was a tricky question. I didn't know it was coming.
No, well, we never sort of plan our questions.
No,
I love catching you out. I mean, I think when I hear the word welfare, the word actually can also simply be taken as, well, how am I doing?
Sure,
in that kind of broader sense. But I think in terms of the political context, then I think you're absolutely right. It's become a very polarizing concept.
Absolutely, yeah. And so, I mean, if you were to go down traditional party lines, you see the Conservatives viewed as the nasty party because they're the party who are going to be cutting things like disability benefits.
That's right.
And you'll see Labour traditionally as on the side of people who are not able to work. And that is why this is so controversial, isn't it? It's because Labour are potentially about to do what might historically be seen as quite an un-Labour thing.
Which is interesting, and we should talk about the politics of this. But I wonder, even just further back, let's ask ourselves another question, which is, from a Christian point of view, how should we begin thinking about the concept of welfare? And the reason I ask that is because we've often said on this podcast that one of the great things about being a follower of Jesus is you don't need to sign yourselves up as being left or right on every issue. You actually can, you can pick and choose a little bit. You can say, well, I connect with, from a Christian perspective, these elements of left-wing thinking, but I want to challenge these elements. And I think the same idea actually applies to welfare. There's something inherently righteous about saying there are people who end up in circumstances, whether through circumstances not of their own making, or simply even through birth, or born into poverty, where we want to get alongside them. We want to give them a hand up, and sometimes a hand out. We'll talk about that distinction.
I'll come on to that in a moment.
We will talk about that. But equally, as a Christian, I want to say, what is the government trying to do? They're trying to get people back into work. And there is a concept that is, again, as a Christian, I've got quite a lot in the Bible to say about how important work is. So as a Christian, I've sketched out there just a couple of kind of broad things, but is there anything you'd want to add? How should we be thinking about welfare and the ongoing debates about, do we cut welfare? How much do we cut? Why should we cut it? And so on.
Sure. Well, I think you have traced out the two kind of competing strands.
Yes.
So what we actually start with the principle about work, first of all, because I think that's a good place to start. And so if we were to look at God's design for humanity, mankind is made to work.
Absolutely.
So you go back to the Garden of Eden, and Adam has a job to do. He is to work the ground and to take care of it. And so then that means that part of the curse of the fall is actually directed at mankind's function. Adam, who was working the ground, well, the ground is going to get harder to till, isn't it? It's going to produce thorns and thistles. So the concept of work is pretty integral to what it means for us to be human. And so that means that today, too, we are supposed to work if we can, and to not do that. And we can come on to exactly what work means in a moment, because it doesn't necessarily mean paid employment. But to not be working is to actually be missing out on something of God's design.
And I think it is really helpful to start here, isn't it? Because of the fall, we can just see work in that context. It's drudgery, it's difficult, it's unsatisfying.
Yeah.
All of that is true because of the curse. The flip side is we forget so quickly Genesis 1 and 2.
It is a good thing.
Work is a good thing.
Yeah.
And I think that you're right. That's where we got it. I think when it comes to this, I think that it's interesting. We can really fall into the trap of, because of the curse, because work is frustrating, of sort of thinking, well, maybe it's not so bad, if people don't work, they've got their problems, they've got their issues. And no, if we're going to work from first principles, we start by saying work is part of the very good of Genesis 1 and 2.
Yeah.
But what do we do then with people who cannot work? What are we saying to them? What's our message to them?
Yeah. Well, I think actually even before we quite get there, I think actually just to build on something you've said there, one of the kind of key questions which the government has got to try and work through is it better to just give a handout, to just support someone, or is it better in the long run for them to help someone to try to get back into work?
Yeah.
And that, I think, is actually going to be one of the key principles for this government, because the government is about economic growth, and it's about trying to get more money back in people's pockets.
Yeah.
That is sort of one of the big things they have said they are for. And so they are, I think, trying not just to be kind of a bit of a downer. They're not trying to be cruel. They want, I think, to get people back into work. And there was one thing which actually I was sort of quite surprised at when I read it, where effectively you could, I think, make twice as much money from an incapacity benefit, which is worth £800 a month for someone who is unfit for work. That is twice as much as you could get for a job seeker's allowance.
Yes.
So actually the system was skewed in favour of not seeking work. And if we were to go back to the Bible, you mentioned earlier, the Bible has a tension, again, between a hand up and a hand out.
Yeah.
One of the interesting passages which I was considering recently for a different piece of work which we're doing, on what the Bible says about poverty, comes in Deuteronomy 15. And I think it's about when people have sold themselves initially into slavery, and then they're being freed. And the former master doesn't just free their slave; they actually give them flocks, and they give them some produce. And actually, the thought behind this is not just that you're giving a handout. You're giving them flocks in order for them to work, to look after them, and to kind of actually have a start back again.
Is there not a danger, though, that we end up... We're saying work is good.
Yeah.
But is there not a danger that we end up idolizing work, making too much of it? Because now you're saying, the big thing is we really should be encouraging people back into work.
Yeah.
Is that the great goal of life? Is that the sum total of,
do we work to live, or do we live to work?
Yeah. I mean, I've always sort of, I agree that work is part of God's good design. Yeah. I agree that we are made to work. I think that is true.
Yeah, I think so far we are in agreement.
I think that's part of being in the image of God.
Yeah.
Because God worked.
Indeed.
And even when he rested, he was still working in a sense, because he was sustaining the entire universe.
Yeah.
So I agree with all of that, but I think one of the things that makes me nervous about the government's rhetoric, and this is true of previous governments, is that everything becomes a narrow understanding of what work is.
Yes, well, now I do agree with this.
And so I think that's where we need to recognise that, for example, if a parent chooses to stay at home rather than go back into the job market, as it were, I think this government and previous governments would basically penalise that through the tax system, through the benefit system. Whereas I would say that is a very, very narrow and actually self-interested view of work.
Agreed.
So we need a broader concept of work.
Can you provide us with a definition of work? Tables have turned.
That's absolutely, that's just a classic.
But the reason I ask you, I'll buy you some time to think about it. I completely agree. So this is why a few minutes ago I made a similar point. Things like when a say you've got a stay-at-home mum who's working to raise a child.
Yes.
Of course, that fits under the definition of work. And it's somewhat arbitrary to say that you've got to kind of bring back a certain amount in your bank balance at the end of the month.
Yes.
In order for something to count. That's given you some time.
Keep going. I need longer. Add to it and make another point.
Oh, no. I guess one of the big contrasts in the Bible is between work and rest, isn't it? So maybe that could be a starting point for us as we try and work through this. What is working and what is resting?
Yeah, and I mean, working can be as simple as accomplishing tasks.
Yep.
Whether that task is, getting your children up in the morning.
Yep.
Or organizing your affairs so that your online banking set up properly.
Looking after a home.
Looking after a home, making sure that the light bulbs are changed and the dishes are done, and actually all of that is bringing order to chaos. And I think now we're back in Genesis.
Very Genesis one of you.
That is exactly what God does. You start with something that is empty, void, and formless, and God brings order to it.
Yeah.
So I think part of work is bringing order to chaos. And that can be applied as simply as tidy your room, bring order to that chaos. And that's what basically we're all doing all the time. And if you go to a chapter like Proverbs 31 and this beautiful picture of a industrious wife, one of the interesting things there is that there is an economic aspect to her work, but there is also just financial management.
Completely.
And so work, therefore, is broader, isn't it? And the way that the Bible writers use the term work, they apply it to good works.
Yep.
That is doing good to others. That could be giving them a lift somewhere. It could be doing shopping for them. It could be just phoning them. It could be sending them a WhatsApp to a brother or sister who's in distress.
Yeah.
And then it talks about the works that Jesus does. Well, the works that Jesus does are the most important works of all because he's accomplishing our salvation for us. And so works then are spiritual duties. It's evangelism. It's proclaiming the gospel. It's social action. It's engaging the culture. Suddenly, actually, you're in a massive, massive field of basically everything we do could be in some level considered a work.
So what is the contrast? What is not work?
So what is not work is when we consciously choose to stop that and Sabbath. And I guess Sabbath then would be we deliberately choose to rest from our ordinary labors.
Yeah.
So we don't do the tidying of the room. We decide not to do the ordering of the house that day. We choose, maybe it's a holiday, maybe it is just a quiet day at home where we might read, we might spend time with church people. I'm not here making a kind of Sabbatarian point around 1 day in 7, and I'm saying that the concept of resting is the opposite of working. We stop doing the tasks.
Yeah.
And this is going to sound very controversial. Arguably, you see the origin of I'm not even sure I agree with this. I'll say it anyway.
Go on.
You see the origin of sort of me time in Sabbath. The idea now, I would caveat that. I would caveat.
I'm getting very nervous.
No need to get nervous. I would caveat that very heavily in that when I say me time, I don't mean that in a selfish way. I mean as in caring for your own soul, or Proverbs 4:23, guarding your heart, cultivating your heart, attending to spiritual disciplines. Ultimately, that you might be a better blessing to others.
Yeah, but I guess you've also got the concept of keeping the Sabbath holy as well, haven't you? There's also that upward relationship with God.
And by the way, there's some great work being done by some Hebrew scholars on the word holy. We often define it very simply as, set apart, or, the idea of righteousness, of moral perfection. But one of the things that these Hebrew scholars have brought out in recent times is that actually, first and foremost, the concept of holiness is of devoted to God.
Yeah.
And I really like that definition. It moves us away from this rigid rules-based understanding of the word and says, it's that Romans 12, like you offer your bodies as a living sacrifice to God, holy and pleasing to him. So I guess where we've ended up is that we, as a Christian, how do we think about welfare? Well, that starts by thinking about work. Yeah. And it starts by going, work is part of the very good of Genesis 1 and 2. Work is what we are made for, but work needs to be defined far more broadly than the economic way that our governments define it.
Yeah.
More than that, we recognize the fall. We recognize that therefore work has been cursed.
And also that we have been cursed and therefore go through things which might mean that we cannot work.
But we also recognize that because of the grace and the power of the Lord Jesus Christ transforming us, that actually our labor, our work in the Lord, 1 Corinthians 15:58, is not in vain. Yeah. That there is still something right and good. We're still obligated to fulfill that great mandate of having a form of dominion and stewardship over the world. So that's where we've ended up. but we've
only done one.
We've
half
only
of it,
done one
haven't we?
half because now we've put that in place.
Yeah.
And I think what you said was really helpful, which is biblically you see this concept of both a hand out.
Yeah.
So the gleaning, they were to leave parts of the gleaning so that the poor could come along and take them up afterwards. That's, as it were, that's a form of hand out.
But it's also a form of hand up because they have to go and collect it, don't they?
But it's that concept, isn't it? Of they, Ruth the Moabitess, she needed that because she didn't have access to
certainly
the rest of the produce, as it were. But then you also see the example you gave from Deuteronomy of a hand up, where you're saying, ultimately, we think we do want to get you back into work.
Yeah.
And let's just, we can take this slower, but let's just throw in another angle in all of this because there's something else complicating the situation here in the UK.
Go on.
Well,
can't complicate it for us.
No, it's the fact that why do we have this ballooning welfare budget?
Yeah.
And by the way, we do. So what are the government thinking? The government are thinking very simply that the current levels of welfare spending are simply unsustainable.
Yeah.
That's the first thing they're thinking. And just to give you an example, one of the reasons that has happened is because of the rise in sickness claims.
Yeah.
So people not working because of sickness. 11 million fit notes are issued every year in England alone, and 93% of patients assessed are declared not fit for work, and that has doubled over the last decade. So we're in a real mess here, aren't we?
And I mean to build on that. So the between 2002 and 2024, the number of 16 to 64-year-olds who were claiming disability benefits, so this isn't just sort of being signed off for a week, disability benefits for mental health conditions increased from 360,000 to 1.28 million. So that has quadrupled. The Treasury's what the Treasury spends on health and disability benefits before the pandemic, that was 28 billion. It's currently 52 billion every year. Sorry, it's every year. By the end of the decade, that's estimated to hit 70 billion.
Yeah.
So that is going up and up and up. So you want to be doing something to reverse some of those trends.
This is why the biblical principle is so important, because if you followed the biblical principle that you need to make sure that any welfare system that you have, and arguably Old Testament Israel did have a form of welfare.
Absolutely it does.
But you've got to make sure that it is accomplishing two goals. One is you decide what your criteria are for a hand out.
Yeah.
But you also need, arguably, would you say, weight it towards a hand up? Because ultimately, where we've ended up is we've ended up in a situation here where, because we're not applying those principles to our welfare system, because there's a lack of ideology being applied. It's much more pragmatic, and we've drifted. The absence of conviction has allowed us to drift into a situation where what we've done is we've created an ever-growing safety net for an ever-increasing number of conditions and situations. That means, in terms of the number of people who could be in work but are not, it's just grown and grown and grown. And so you can see now why the biblical teaching is so important. And
completely.
You can have some sympathy with the government who have the responsibility to steward the economy.
Yeah.
We can't afford this level of welfare spending that you cited, 50 odd billion pounds a year. We can't afford that for with an aging population. And so they're trying to make some cuts, but I'd like to see them go back to first principles.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing which we haven't necessarily fully drawn out yet, as Christians, we absolutely do believe in looking after the poor and the widow and the orphan and the foreigner.
Quartet of the vulnerable.
The quartet of the vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so if we were to think about, for instance, that kind of classic verse from the book of James, sort of like religion.
True religion, pure religion.
Exactly, which the Father accepts is this, to look after widows in their distress.
Yeah.
So there absolutely is a biblical principle for us to do that. One of to take it into slightly more tricksy ground.
Yes, because I'm brimming now.
There is some teaching within the New Testament, in particular, within a church context, about the difference between, and I'm using these terms slightly hesitantly because I'm putting them onto the text, a deserving poor and an undeserving poor.
Yeah.
So, for instance, there was the list of widows.
175.
Exactly. And there were certain qualifications someone had to meet to go on to the list of widows.
You weren't automatically on that list just because you were a widow.
No, exactly. So you had to be, I think it was over the age of 60. You had to have been faithful to your husband. You had to be well known for good deeds. You had to have shown hospitality and helped those in need.
And so, for example, 1 Timothy 5:5, the widow who is really in need, that's the kind of language. No widow may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60, has been faithful to her husband, is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the Lord's people, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds.
Exactly. So there is that distinction there, isn't there, between... I think there's probably a recognition. You just cannot help everyone even as much as you might want to within a society. But also, secondly, within a fallen system or within a fallen world where we know as humans we don't always act as we ought to, within any system there will be a small number of people who try and game it. Yeah. And that is not me in any way trying to shift the onus and sort of blame people for welfare problems at all. But it is me just saying, within any system, the fall has an impact, and therefore systems don't work perfectly.
But this is why what you have when debates about welfare take place is you have I think in the public square sometimes an inability to properly debate these things because people take such emotive stances on them
and such binary
and
stances
such binary
well.
and such black and white stances on them. But I would also add to that something that we haven't said is. All of this is based on, I don't think it is, but it could be perceived as being based on a presupposition that, when it comes to welfare, it's the state or no one. And I disagree with that. I think biblically, that is not the only institution that is capable of delivering welfare support. And one of the problems that we have in this country, and this isn't a political point really, although it will be perceived as such, is that we look to the state for more and more and more. And in fact, the previous Conservative governments expanded the role of the state in our national life. Now, from a biblical perspective, I do not doubt for a single minute that there is a role for the state to play. We believe in good government, Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, Titus 3. We believe in that. However, God created different institutions to perform different roles, different authority structures, including, and interestingly, 1 Timothy 5 would be an example of this. 1 Timothy 5 is saying that a widow should first be looked after within the context of her own family.
Completely.
Secondly, if that is not possible, then if she meets criteria, can be looked after in the context of the church. And it wouldn't talk here about the state simply because there was no welfare state. But if there was, I would argue that would then be the third institution to get involved. And I think that's why when it comes to welfare, we've got a £50 billion welfare state because we've said the only people who can provide this welfare is the state. Well, here's a question. Does your church have a list of widows? 1 Timothy 5. Does my church have a list? Yeah. Does your church have a list of widows? We literally have biblical instructions and we don't even bother to follow them.
But as you said, the first point of call is the family.
Yes.
And so what does it say about us as a society more generally?
Yes.
And I guess within the West, we have gone down this real route of sort of individualism.
Autonomy.
Exactly, kind of personal freedom.
But it's devastating.
You wouldn't kind of find situations like this in other parts of the world, which might be technically far less financially well off, but where there would be far greater bonds in terms of caring for your family members.
And the problem becomes when talking as I've just talked and as we have just talked, is the source then of criticism politically, because what people hear is us saying that we don't care about the poor, we don't care about the stranger, we don't care about the widow. And I would say, no, what we care about is helping them in the right way, using the right form of help. And it's even before you get to whether it's a hand up or a hand out, let's say first and foremost that we've put too much emphasis on state help and we've diminished the role of family, diminished the role, I think, of church as well. That's something for churches to think about. But coming back to family, you're absolutely right. Other cultures do not have a massive welfare budget like we do, and yet people are looked after, people are supported because they've not gone down this arrogant secularist route in the West where we go, the great moral virtue of our time is autonomy.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of closing thoughts, and then I think we probably ought to start moving on to the next topic.
We'll just leave the rest. We could go on. We should have done this on a single issue. This is so good.
Well, I guess it's such
really
an
getting
interesting
into
topic, isn't it?
Yes.
A couple of final thoughts.
Yeah.
The first would be looking at Jesus, which is always a good principle. But
yes,
I guess Jesus, when he encounters someone who is, as in many cases, were not able to work. So whether that is a leper by the side of the road who is then ostracised from the community, or whether it is someone who is lame who can't be dragged down to the pool. Jesus doesn't just give a handout. Jesus works through his own power, for the restoration of the person.
Yes, I agree.
And a sort of, it's a much more kind of holistic view of what help looks like. Help for Jesus did not just mean giving someone some coins.
Yeah.
It looked like helping to reintegrate someone back into society fully.
Yeah.
The second thing, which I think is just it is always, again, useful just to think about this, because it's very easy for us to sound very harsh sometimes. And I know my own personal instinct on this would be to go down a more of a sort of pull yourself together route, like do what you like. I guess I'm sort of 2 generations out of date. So I'm sort of like a stiff upper lip, kind of keep calm and carry on naturally.
You're an 80-year-old trapped in a 30-year-old
Absolutely.
body. Yeah. So am I. Less so.
Less. I mean, do you have a membership of National Trust?
No.
There you go.
Yes, sorry, carry on. Yeah.
So that might be what my instinct is.
Yes.
Kind of keep calm, carry on, stiff upper lip. But again, I have to go back to Jesus and to be challenged and let the Bible shape the agenda, and particularly let the gospel shape the agenda, and recognise that actually I am the recipient of undeserved grace.
Yes.
And then that ought to shape my thoughts towards people, and it ought to shape my actions towards them, and it ought to make my heart feel far softer. And that is not me saying that means that you just wipe all of what we just talked about under the carpet.
No.
Because there is a principle where like you have to govern responsibly. But it is a thing, I think, where my own heart needs to be gentler and softer rather than coming down with justice.
Absolutely. But I think it's really important also to say that the accusations of talking about welfare and the role of the state and family and church and problems in the way that we've structured things in society is not an absence of love, but it is love itself, because love is always connected with truth. And it's not loving to create an over-bloated welfare system where actually what we're saying to people is you can survive by living off the state, even if you are actually well enough to go into work. It's not actually good for people if we do that. And so real love in this situation is like Jesus in that it would discern, and this is where we need wisdom, it would discern what we need to do in each instance. In each case, taking it on its merits and recognizing there are some people who need long-term support, and we should have a system that supports them. But there are others who do need the hard stick of justice because they're gaming the system. And that is not an absence of love to say that. I think that the moment you start wielding the love card, you've just got to be really cautious. Not that you are, I mean more in the debate. You've got to be really cautious because you can quickly shut down legitimate debate with a very lazy argument.
Well, I think love as a term, and we've seen this in a variety of contexts, gets very easily politicized, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
And actually, as you have pointed out, like love can mean different outcomes.
Yeah, that's right.
As a Christian, I'm almost less interested in the term love and more interested in the term grace, because grace encapsulates more of both like love and justice in tandem. I feel like throughout this conversation we've covered a whole variety of routes, and we've in a sense we've almost kind of shown how it's quite a tricky debate.
Oh, it's hugely tricky
because there isn't a kind of clear cut
No.
route. And it's
That's right.
And probably my encouragement actually, as you're listening or watching, would be to reflect on your own biases you come to this conversation with, because I think we all come from a starting point.
Yes.
And both you and I do as well. And I suspect we're probably
Quite aligned.
When the cameras are off. I imagine we probably are quite aligned. But use your brain to kind of engage with what the Bible would say to your biases, and kind of try and let the Bible shape the agenda, rather than saying, I am coming in thinking this, let me look for a Bible to back it up. Let the Bible and the tensions the Bible has shape the way you think about it.
And it's good. I think it's good for people to see the reality of real complexity of how we can't start a conversation about welfare and what the government's planning to do and give a black and white, this is wrong, this is right.
Yeah.
We can work from biblical principles and then go, whoa, you know what, it would take a lot of work and you know, other minds to come together to go, how do we work this out in society? How do we put this together?
Yeah.
And that is an ongoing, you're absolutely right, living with the tensions
Completely.
and being balanced in response and saying, well, I'm going to try to hold the biblical teachings in a balance.
Yeah.
Hard work. Well, let's talk then about this case that's come up. It's a free speech case, because I think this is worth commenting on, because it is of interest.
Yeah.
So it's the case of Clive Johnston. He's a 76-year-old former president of the Association of Baptist Churches in Ireland. He's a grandfather of 7, and he is being prosecuted under abortion buffer zone laws in Northern Ireland for preaching an open-air sermon on John 3:16, the most famous verse in the Bible, arguably. Critical to this case, and the reason why it's of interest, is he never mentioned abortion. His sermon was not on abortion. And where we are at the moment is he's facing 2 charges under the Abortion Services Safe Access Zones Act for holding an open-air Sunday service on the fringes of a buffer zone. And he's accused of seeking to influence people accessing the hospital's abortion services, and for not immediately leaving the area when asked to do so by the police. If he is prosecuted and found guilty, he faces a criminal record and a maximum fine totaling thousands of pounds. He's never been in trouble with the police before. And just so everyone understands, in Northern Ireland, there are 8 100 to 150 metre buffer zones around hospitals and abortion facilities. And it's a criminal offence to impede, record, influence, or to be caused harassment, alarm, or distress within those areas. And this case has been taken up by the Christian Institute, who are arguing that nowhere in the legislation did it say anything about not being allowed to preach a gospel sermon, for example, in a buffer zone. And so the crucial question, the test that is now playing itself out here is, does abortion buffer zones and the policy that says you cannot influence, et cetera, does that mean that even speech that has got nothing to do with abortion is criminalized in that buffer zone area? Or is this a drafting error? Is this part of an evidence that shows you how difficult it is to police speech in any way, shape, or form? And therefore, such laws ultimately will always create these kind of problems. And also, the more concerning thing is, you could look at this very simply and say, here is a Christian man who's been prosecuted under the law of the land in a part of the United Kingdom because he preached a sermon on John 3:16. Well, however you look at it, that is pretty alarming.
Yeah, I guess the question which the police are really going to have to answer is, why do they think just the presence of a Christian talking about Christian things which are not to do with abortion, why do they think that fits under that law?
Yeah, and do they even understand the law?
Yeah. Do they think that merely preaching about the fact that God so loved the world,
yes,
do they think that is intimidating to a woman who is pursuing an abortion?
Yeah.
I mean, it is. I find cases like this quite tricky and frustrating, because we all know that this kind of situation shouldn't happen and that it is bizarre.
Yeah.
And yet we also know, I think, that as Christians we are not told to expect a right to free speech.
I think this is so important.
And that was not the experience of the early church.
No.
And they were brought in. You remember the story where Peter and John are brought in front of the Sanhedrin, and they've just healed someone, and the Sanhedrin are like, please, well, not, we don't say please, they will order them to stop talking about Jesus. Free speech has never been a Christian expectation. And Jesus said, look, if the world hates you, it hated me first.
Yes,
and so it's just that difficult tension, isn't it? When we think through it between what should happen and what we should expect.
And I think that's right. I mean, I think, blessed are you when you're persecuted. That seems to be the general expectation in the New Testament. The flip side of all of that being that the Apostle Paul, for example, used his rights as a citizen, used the mechanics of Roman law in order to be able to defend his right to continue his ministry. And so I think that when it comes to free speech, we have to balance what is our biblical expectation with here is a right and a privilege that actually is good for all people and has been a blessing that we've enjoyed in the United Kingdom for successive generations. And therefore, it's not wrong to use the mechanics of the law that are open to us to make the case that this right should be protected and upheld.
Yeah.
And I think cases like this, you're absolutely right. They raise questions for the police, but they also raise questions for politicians.
Yeah.
Are they willing to put their hands up and go, politicians who supported the buffer zone law in Northern Ireland, will they put their hands up and go, that was never what this law was intended to do.
Yeah.
And this is wrong that this has happened. The police got this wrong. Now, that would be fantastic if that happened. I highly doubt that it will. But I think this is one of those cases that will set a really, really interesting precedent for good or for ill in terms of how we apply and understand buffer zone laws and what you can or cannot say within them.
Well, yeah. Well, even to be fair, I mean, even here in England,
yes.
When there have been cases like this, and then it's sort of been challenged, then the police have ended up losing the case, haven't
yes,
they? There was the case a couple of times with Isabel Vaughan Spruce,
yes,
who was praying in her head outside an abortion clinic, and eventually the police were forced to back down on it. So it's difficult to know quite where it's going to land.
And I think, again, another tension here is that I can see an argument for saying, well, free speech facilitates the spread of the gospel.
Yeah.
I can also see an argument for saying, well, God isn't limited in that way. So as in when the early church began meeting and the gospel spread and people were added to the church on a daily basis, they did not have the privilege of free speech. So God is not limited in the same way. And that gives us both confidence. And I do sometimes worry that the way free speech is kind of talked about by Christians here, it's as if we lost that, then everything would be lost. What utter nonsense.
That sort of implies we wouldn't keep preaching the gospel when clearly we would.
I want to see free speech upheld because I think, 1 Timothy 2, pray for those in authority, ultimately because God is Savior and there's one mediator and he wants people to come and be saved. I think it facilitates and helps gospel proclamation. But Acts 5:29, Peter and John, they say, you do what you want. We have to speak about God. We have to speak about Jesus.
We would obey God rather than
absolutely.
Man,
so I think this is worth people being aware of this case. I think it is a precedent-setting case. And I think that it raises questions for the police, questions for politicians, and questions ultimately for society. Have we reached the limits of toleration with a Christian message on John 3:16 in the open air, or have we not? Now, I suspect what we will see, I hope what we will see, is common sense prevailing.
I think we will,
time will tell.
Yeah.
Now, do we have time?
I think we can do it.
You're desperate, aren't you? Desperate.
No, we don't have to do it.
What do you reckon? Well, I mean, so you wrote an article on
Friday,
and this was based off a BBC News story.
Yes.
And this was partly to do with, you ended up talking about a big review that's been done into the impact of pornography. But what was the BBC News article?
Yeah, so this was prompted, my piece was prompted by reading the day before. I think when I read it, it was the number 2 headline on the BBC News website. An article, he strangled me without asking, in inverted commas. Experts say choking during sex now normal for many. And within that BBC report, there were a number of stories. There were some pretty frightening statistics. I think the statistic is that amongst 18 to 34-year-olds, about 18 to 34-year-old girls, or women, sorry, about a third of them have experienced choking during sex, which is just unfathomably high, I think, to some of us. And the real thing which has meant that behaviour has been normalised has been the increase in it being portrayed in pornography. So 79% of young people have seen violent pornography before the age of 18. 47% of young people said that girls would expect sex to involve violent behaviour, such as slapping or choking. Someone is 50% more likely to have experienced a violent sex act if they are a frequent user of pornography. So there's a very clear link there.
We need to end and destroy the porn industry, don't we?
Well, I would love to see the abolition of the pornography industry.
It has not a single,
in the same way there's been abolition of slavery.
Yeah, there's not a single redeeming feature in it. It is profoundly exploitative. It gives completely the wrong impression about what true sex is. And actually, as Christians, we can be passionately negative about the porn industry and passionately positive about the good gift that sex is in the right context as the most wonderful blessing that God has one of the most wonderful blessings that God has given to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things just to kind of keep in mind as we shape it. So yeah, I absolutely agree. I would love to see it destroyed. Pornographic content in some way or other has existed for thousands of years. So I mean, in fact, you've been to Pompeii as well. I mean, did you go to did you see the brothel when you were there? And there's sort of pornographic art on the walls. And so it is not a new development.
No.
I think what is a new development, obviously, is with our new technologies, we are therefore able to film things, or you're even able to use artificial intelligence to generate things.
And it's the mass commercialization of it.
And so things are now far more, I don't know what the right word would be, sort of scintillating for someone to watch than just like a static painting. And that means that it's going to be far more damaging as well. I think we've seen a really dark trend in recent decades, where pornography is becoming increasing, or there's an increasing prevalence of disturbing pornography. And the title from the Children's Commissioner's report into the impact of pornography on young people really kind of sums this up. So she entitled her report on porn, a lot of it is actually just abuse.
Yes.
And it is so depressing, and it is then really shaping the way in which young people do then think about sex. Do you want to talk about the porn review? Because I know that's something which we've been involved in.
Well, that's right, yeah. So, I mean, you actually list in your article that you say pornography in its very essence sells everyone short, and then it damages the performers, it damages the consumers, it damages marriages, and it's a contradiction of our fundamental identity as men and women who are made in the image of God, not animals in a zoo, which I thought was really helpful. In terms of the porn review, that is something that CARE pushed for, and we pushed for it via amendments that we drafted to a previous government bill. And the deal was that we, working with our allies in Parliament, we withdrew those amendments because this review was promised. And it took a long time to actually get it off the ground, but it has now been led by the Conservative peer Baroness Burton, and it has finally been published. And really, at its heart is a very simple recommendation. Make illegal all online pornography, which includes choking. Make illegal pornography, which includes adults dressing as children. Make illegal degrading, violent and misogynistic themes, and ban nudification apps in which new technologies develop a naked image of a fully clothed figure. There should be parity between how we deal with pornography offline, that's in the form of DVDs or even magazines, and how we deal with pornography online. Now, that seems to me to be a very common sense recommendation. But as you rightly point out, from CARE's point of view, fantastic this review has been published. The onus is now on the government. What are you going to do about it? Because it's the government that have got to take action. But I also really appreciated where you ended the article, which is, it is right that we push for law reform. It is right that we push for legislative change. We must do all we can upstream of the problem to stop people becoming so easily addicted to porn in the first place. But that will only get us so far, because what is ultimately needed is a reform of the human heart. And now we're into the realm of the Christian gospel, of transformation, of new life, of new birth. And that's not denying in God's common grace that people addicted to porn, like Terry Crews, can stop being addicted without necessarily the full Christian experience, as it were. But at the same time, what you're saying is actually that the Christian message has such a holistic, positive vision for sex, a better story. And people in our society are desperate for meaning, desperate for authenticity, desperate to find something different from what the world offers. I mean, the Christian gospel offers all of that and then some.
I think there are two particular things here, aren't there? So I would love to see people not feeling like they want to use pornography, full stop. which is a kind of real cheapening, I think, of the gift which sex is. The quote which I think is really good, which Louise Perry definitely includes in her book, is sort of it turns human beings into body parts.
Yeah.
It is something which turns something which should be really intimate and loving into a world of cheap thrills in a shadowy room on a computer screen.
Yeah.
So I'd love to see people not use pornography full stop. But also, and I think this is somewhere where we as Christians can actually do a better job, not just within the church, but also in terms of speaking out to the world. We need to present a better vision of what sex actually is. Because the only message, pretty much, which I have ever heard within a Christian context is don't do it outside marriage. That's what you get taught when you're in your youth group. Don't do it before marriage. It's what I remember hearing at university. Don't do it before marriage. Occasionally you get sex is created by God. Sometimes someone says that as well, which is true. And obviously we believe don't do it before marriage or outside marriage. And like that is an important message. But we have said so little, I think, about what good sex would look like in terms of looking to love a partner and to affirm them and never to degrade them and looking to serve them. And this whole story has come out of something which is incredibly degrading and debasing. The idea of choking someone or slapping someone, that is not treating a partner as someone who is made in God's image. And so we need to kind of get back to a view of sex, which is all about loving someone and giving sacrificially.
And the irony of the failure which you've articulated of the church to teach well on this is that actually the sexual intimacy between a husband and a wife is a picture of the intimacy between Christ and his people. In other words, sex is not just a good gift that God gives us. It's actually one of the fundamental ways that we understand just how deep the connection is between Jesus and his bride, the church. And you get to Ephesians 5, and it's you can brush over it so easily, the language that Paul uses, but when you stop and think about what he's saying about that relationship, it is one of the most profound statements of the one fleshness that exists between the Son of God and his people. It is utterly stunning. And when you start there, you already have an expanded understanding of what sex points us to. That you don't even have to use the word don't in all of that. You start in the place of beauty, in the place of sacrificial love and commitment, and you work out from there. And then you put in some of the fences. You do need to do that. You do need to have a little bit of guidance around what is acceptable, what
Certainly,
isn't. But you're right, where you start with a much deeper, richer, more beautiful, more vivid picture of what sex really is.
And I think the thing is, we've only ever really, as a church, provided an answer to one question. The one question we've provided the answer to, who, effectively is who or when.
Who or when? Yeah.
What we have not provided answers to is things like, well, what types of sex are okay?
Yeah, and why have it?
Yeah, what does sex mean?
What does it mean? That's right. But part of this is wrapped up in, part of it's wrapped up in, I mean, Christopher Ash is helpful on this. I think the Kellers are helpful on this in their books on marriage. But there has been a tendency, and Catholic teaching would take this view, that sex is primarily, if not exclusively, for procreation. Whereas I think biblically, you can have a much broader understanding that alongside that, I'm not denying that is part of its purpose. Alongside that, actually intimacy, the expression of one fleshness, the expression of the deepest human relationship that a human being enters into. Again, you're starting with the positive, aren't you? You're starting with the fuller vision that we find.
Yeah, and I wonder whether part of it is, as Christians, and maybe this is a hang-up of 200 years ago, we just get a bit awkward and a bit prudish.
Possibly,
and so therefore we don't want to to go into the sort of slightly more messy areas.
Can I add to that though? I think it's not just that. I think we also tie ourselves in knots because we're so worried about offending people.
Yeah, I think that's also
because
true.
we're saying marriage is between one man and one woman in the context of marriage. It's all well and good. Two of us are married guys. So people could easily say, well, it's all right for you two. Whereas, I'm a single person. I want to be married. And you're saying to me, all I'm still hearing is don't.
Yeah.
What's the message for them?
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, that is a separate question again,
course.
in that we need to provide a much richer
Jesus
vision of
was
singleness.
single, wasn't he? Paul said, I wish you were all single.
I guess the thing is, if people have got these questions, and I know that people do, because I have had peers of mine effectively ask me a bunch of questions because they don't know the answers and no one's ever talked to them. Well, then the void is going to get filled from somewhere.
Yeah.
And if, as the church, we don't provide any answers to these questions, for lots of young people, they will go to the place where they can find an answer. And for many, that is pornography. And so one girl in the Children's Commissioner's report summed it up by saying, well, pornography is the starting point for young people when it comes to sex. Yeah. So we have got to recognise that is the reality. People are not starting from a neutral position here. And so we need to provide a positive vision of what sex is, what it looks like to love someone as opposed to just lust after them and seek your own pleasure. And that should be a really exciting prospect for us as the church. And so I really do hope that we take this as a bit of a wake-up call.
Yes.
And effectively get to it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that, I would certainly commend people, if you're interested in what we've just talked about, then a starting point would be to go and read Peter's article on CARE's website, care.org.uk/news. It's the latest opinion piece. Well, we've covered everything, haven't we? We've covered welfare, we've covered Russia, Ukraine, we've covered a street preacher case, and now we've covered nudification and choking during sex. So you cannot say that the Engage podcast is unafraid to go, narrow focus, unafraid to go into places of all varieties, shall we say.
Yeah, indeed.
But we're going to draw stumps here. Loads that we've covered. If there's any questions or comments on anything that we've said, please do get in touch with us. Thank you for those who comment faithfully on our YouTube videos when we put them out. We read every comment that is made and we do take them into consideration. But until next time, Peter, goodbye.
Goodbye.